Welcome to the Community Development Podcast. A podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Welcome to episode 47, and we are returning, not literally, sadly for me, to Scotland, where we've been for a couple of episodes, and to Leith in Edinburgh, more specifically. Before I introduce the guests, quick plug for the last episode out, where I was only a couple of miles away, as the crow flies, from where I'm sitting in Cardiff in South Wales, and I was talking to Dr. Dave Wyatt from Cardiff University, a reader in civic mission there, and who is one of the founders, the leaders, the stewards of a pioneering award-winning project in Cardiff, the Caer Heritage Project, C-A-E-R, Caer, that's the Welsh word for fort or fortified settlement. And Dave was talking about how community organisations, community development, co-production have all kind of the alchemy that has been created as part of that project in Ely, in the west of the city, as part of the university's sort of civic mission and its kind of outreach type work, which has gone way beyond what outreach maybe tends to involve, and is now into its second decade as a programme, and he was telling us a little bit about that. Before that, we went to Fallin, near Stirling in Scotland, where we were talking about community action and climate change with Naomi and the gang, and before that, again, we were back in Scotland with Catherine Wheeler from the Stove Network, talking about creative placemaking in Scotland, but more specifically Dumfries and Galloway, where Catherine is based. That's enough of previous podcast episodes. Let's get cracking with this one. Like I said, we're back off to Scotland. We're over towards the east coast this time, and I hope I'm not butchering the geography there. It's a warm welcome to the podcast to Hannah Kitchen Kirby. Welcome to the podcast, Hannah.
Hello.
And also to Clare MacGillivray. Welcome, Clare.
Thank you.
Yeah, so like I said, we're back in Scotland. We're going to be talking about rights. We're going to be talking about them, though not in an abstract way, not in a theoretical way. Well, we may touch on that, but we're going to try and talk about them in a little bit more grounded, contextualised manner in relation to people's practice. But before we do all of that, Hannah, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, about where you're working, about the organisation you work for? Anything, the floor is yours.
Yep, so my name is Hannah Kitchen Kirby, and I work for a project that is called Inspiring Leith. And we are primarily sort of an assets-based community development project that's based within a larger homelessness charity called Bethany Christian Trust. And we basically kind of are out and about in the community, listen to people, get to know folk, and focus on kind of what people are interested in, what they're excited about, and help them get things going, get groups going. The only rule is that they need to be kind of free and accessible to everyone. So over the years, we've started up community gardens with people, a community cinema, archery, craft groups, like all sorts of things, just depending on what ideas people have. And the reason that I'm on this episode with Clare is that one of those groups was focused around Cables Wynd House in Edinburgh, which people might know as the Banana Flats, which features in Trainspotting, the film, and the book by Irvine Welsh. And we kind of were working with them, and that has kind of turned into more of a rights-based campaign, just because the folk that we met there were kind of so struggling with the kind of neglect of their building. So I'll tell you more about that in a bit, but that's me.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned Irvine Welsh and Trainspotting. I feel a bit on firmer territory now, because about as much as I know of Leith is probably from his work. Clare, over to you. Tell us a little bit about your work and where you're based.
Sure. So I'm Clare MacGillivray, and I'm the director of Making Rights Real, which is a small charity in Scotland using a rights-based approach to community development to support communities really who are marginalised, to use the power of human rights as a tool for social change. I'm also on the international committee of the International Association for Community Development, IACD, which many of your listeners will be familiar with. I chaired the World Community Development Conference in Dundee in 2019 as well, so I've been well involved with IACD over about 10 years. And as well as that, a fellow from the Atlantic Fellows Social and Economic Equity Programme at London School of Economics in the International Institute for Inequalities. But really what I'm doing is stuff I love with people I love, which is basically community development work in a rights-based way with communities across Scotland.
Thanks, Claire. By the time this comes out, there'll probably be another episode of the IACD podcast out in which you also get a name check, and that's in the context of sort of ethics, values, and very much related to the wider concept of rights and having a human rights based approach and things like that. So it's not ready yet, that episode, or it's not out yet, but certainly by the time this has come out, just search for IACD Global on whatever podcast app you use, and you should find that. And that's with Anna Clark and Anastasia Crickley from IACD. And Anastasia was talking about some of the work that, by way of illustrating these points about things like values and ethics, was talking about some of the work that she's involved with in Ireland with, well, not just in Ireland down the years, but more recently in Ireland with people from the traveller community. And that's also a strong theme and a focus of the article that you recently had in the IACD's Practice Insights magazine, which is kind of, I guess, how we all came to be on the same sort of radar, if you like, with respect to this episode. Do you want to give us a little flavour of that article?
Yeah, I've been in discussions with Anastasia and Anna, who's the chair of IACD, for a while around how do we do an article around human rights, and particularly probably do a special edition of Practice Insights based on a rights-based approach. And the article I wrote was around some of the practice that we've been doing here in Scotland. I've been a community worker for 25 years, and for the last 10 years I've been using a rights-based approach in practice. So the article talks a little bit about what is a human rights-based approach, why are we using human rights as a tool for change, and a bit about work that we've been doing with Gypsy Traveller communities in Scotland to look at their conditions, where they're living, and to identify which of those issues are human rights issues and how they can hold duty bearers or public authorities to account. And quite often people don't think of themselves as rights holders or people who have been given rights due to the fact of them being human, and how they can actually hold public authorities to account for change, to challenge systemic abuses of racism and other kind of structural ways which people are marginalised. So the work that we've been doing with Double Dykes tenants in Perth, it's a public authority owned site, and tenants have been saying to us that they were finding some difficulties in relation to their housing conditions, experiencing mould, experiencing dampness and rats, mice, sewage, and had a whole host of concerns. So what we did was supported them to carry out participatory action research with other residents on the site and asked them a whole series of questions about what they were experiencing to try and get a bit of a collective view. And once we'd got back a lot of the feedback from interviews and questionnaires, we then started to look at what are the themes that are coming out of that. And then saw things around children's rights, around the right to accommodation, around the right to participate, and the right to live free from discrimination. So we started to then quantify, okay, which of these rights are the most difficult for you to experience, and what do you actually want to change? So we set indicators, for example, around children's rights, where people wanted an increased percentage of people who felt it was safe for children to play in their area. And in 2022, when we carried out the first round of surveys, we felt that it was quite a poor response. So there were around 67% of children who didn't feel that their site was safe, and we wanted to increase that then to 80%. So people found out what the issues were, they looked at which of these were human rights issues, and they then set concrete indicators for change, as well as then reporting to the duty bearers recommendations of what would improve their life. And we've been doing that over 3 years. So there are 2 reports which have come out. by the residents at Double Dykes. And we've couched those in international human rights terms about what needs to change, and identified what the duty bearers need to do to make structural change happen. And we've been very fortunate to have the support of the Scottish Human Rights Commission and international support from Anastasia Crickley, who, as you know, is the chair of Pavy Point over in Ireland, the main organisation for travellers in Ireland, but also the chair of Minority Rights International. So that kind of public holding to account of public authorities is really the work that's been done in Double Dykes really successfully, and I think the work that they're doing is really the gold standard for other communities across Scotland, but also globally, of how to organise collectively around your rights and practice.
Thanks, Claire. And you're right, actually, to point out that the whole edition of Practice Insights is around human rights and community development. It wasn't just your article, or indeed Hannah's. Which can I invite you, Hannah, to just maybe give a flavour of your article? It's alongside Claire's. It's kind of like the lead articles in this edition of Practice Insights, entitled "Strength, Friendships, Rights and Change."
My article is just really telling the story of, because I've been working with a colleague in that building, which has 212 flats, for about 6 years now. And as I say, it kind of started off much more kind of assets-based community development, getting to know people, which took a really long time because, and the article kind of talks about how, you know, when we first knocked on a few doors or chatted to people in the foyer or kind of met people through other organisations, a lot of people said to us like, oh, I just keep myself to myself, because the building is, it's kind of famous for negative reasons, I would say, and I think people take that on. That's another article that I've got coming up in Concept, kind of talks about that, really, about the experience of people and the stigma towards their particular building. So that was kind of where we were starting, and then all the assets-based stuff did really help us in terms of just kind of connecting with people, listening to people, which I know Claire is absolutely amazing at as well, using the rights-based approach. It's not kind of abstract or it's very warm, and it's about people's real experiences and listening to people and their relationships, and then kind of linking those to human rights. But my article kind of just reflects on that journey, really, that as we gradually found that actually the biggest thing in people's lives in that situation was the housing conditions. It was affecting people's health. There was things like broken lifts, damp and mold again. The stairwells were like very, being used as a toilet. The kids, a lot of people mentioned not feeling safe in the building. So we moved from seeing, does anyone want to start a garden? And, a few people did, and a few people did like a Zumba class or whatever. But it was once, I think, we really were able to listen to people saying, this is really getting to us, we really need some help with this. And we then made links with Claire. We kind of learnt about some of her work beforehand elsewhere in Leith, actually, using human rights, and thought, oh, maybe we could do that here. And so I guess it's quite a good example of how, a community group that is not well versed in all of this stuff can kind of learn how to use it to great effect.
It's very similar. I was over in Ely this morning. The part of Cardiff I was talking about a little bit earlier, where I recorded the episode with Dave Wyatt last time out, and there were some civil disturbances back in 1991, so-called Ely riots, and people still talk about them, and it still kind of gets rolled out. So I can very much perhaps identify, maybe for slightly different reasons, it becomes a very easy stick to hit and label pejoratively so certain communities. So when I read the article, because I've been doing some work in Ely as well, it kind of resonated, I think, and people can maybe internalise some of that as well. Maybe that's a natural response in some respects.
Yeah, and I think there's quite a lot of evidence for actually that sense of sort of a building's reputation or an area's reputation kind of affecting people's health in different ways. Kind of both by that sense of just stress and like, oh, I live in this place and, you know, everybody calls it notorious and, you know, all that sort of thing. And then, but then also that kind of idea that people can withdraw into themselves a bit because they don't want to be associated with it or they're worried about it. And then that kind of can make that sort of people coming together and kind of community building a lot harder because you know, a few people said to us, oh, you know, good luck with it, but I'm moving out as soon as I can, basically, because of this idea that it's kind of a bad place. Whereas, you know, obviously once you get to know lots of people in the building, it's not a bad place at all. But also I think sometimes it can even play into kind of the way that the local authority and the landlord, well, that's the same thing, Edinburgh City Council is the landlord. And just that kind of it becomes accepted that it's a, you know, a sort of place with lots of problems and therefore why should they spend lots of money on keeping it all clean and, you know, which they're changing their tune on now. In fact, they're going to refurbish it all, you know, thanks to the rights-based stuff. We've kind of successfully campaigned for new lifts and but I think really importantly the rights-based approach also really helps people kind of tackle that sense of stigma and you know, this place isn't that good or whatever, and sort of people just accepting maybe that it's not a great place and instead thinking, well no, actually this is my right to adequate housing and we all deserve to kind of live in a place that is safe and not mouldy and, you know, just decent. And it's been really wonderful to see how that's brought people together and actually brought real kind of change with how the relationship with Edinburgh Council is and just people's ability to claim their own rights and rights for kind of their neighbours that they know don't have time to do campaigning. You know, we've got loads of care and responsibilities and things like that.
I mean, I think it's totally transformative what you're doing, Hannah, and you're being very humble about the work that you've done, because what this work has done in Cables Wynd House is really shift that narrative that we're rights holders and we will hold you to account. And by the way, Russell, the council is spending £69 million in refurbishing the homes in Leith, and that's a fantastic turnaround. Because we had the head of, you know, the convener for housing saying, actually, on national telly, we failed the tenants here and we want to take responsibility for this. And I think the work that Hannah has done, particularly in that grassroots organising, listening to people, bringing people together, has made the group so much stronger that they're now able to articulate really well, actually, these are our rights, you're failing, and this is how we need to change. And it's brilliant to see the Edinburgh Council has now put up their hand and said, yeah, we're going to invest really significant amounts of money to make this shift work. And Hannah's done incredible work along with the grassroots activists on the ground to really make that shift happen.
No, and I echo all of that. Simplifying it a little bit, perhaps, that's a little bit downstream, those sorts of, you know, results and outcomes. A bit further upstream is something that you talk about in your article, Claire, spending time, people at Double Dykes, for instance, helping them understand and learn about human rights, that they have them, that this is what they mean. To what extent do you find, maybe in other examples of your work or other people you know working in this space, that actually that lack of awareness, if that's the right way of putting it, about rights is prevalent?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, we don't usually go into a community starting to talk about rights. We go in listening.
No.
What's going on for you in your community? What's happening in your life? And quite often spending time to build those relationships means that you can have those conversations about really difficult topics like inadequate housing. And individuals often feel that it's just me. You know, I'm not going to complain. I've complained for 20 years, nothing's going to change. And individually, people are feeling that. But once you start to bring folk together and start to talk around, actually, if you're feeling that, maybe other people are as well. And then when you introduce the concept that, did you know there was a right to an adequate standard of living, which includes the right to housing, and it includes the habitability standard, which means that you should not be experiencing mice, rats, mould, vermin, lifts not working, that you should be able to enjoy a safe home which is warm and protects you from the wind and the rain. People's views kind of change. The light goes on to say, actually, what do you mean there's a right to housing? I'll never forget that when you're in the room the first time, when the light goes on to say, what do you mean I've got a right? I've got a right to housing. I never knew that, because people don't understand that rights are for all of us, for every single one of us in our everyday interactions. I love the quote from Eleanor Roosevelt in 1948 when she was writing the Declaration of Human Rights, and she was the chair of the drafting committee. And she said, "Where, after all, do human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they can't be seen on any maps of the world, but they're the world of the individual person, the neighbourhood they live in, the school or college they attend, and the factory or office where they work. Those are the places where equal opportunity, dignity are held for every human being." So unless those rights really have meaning in those small places close to home, where people can experience them every day, they don't know that they have human rights. And unless they're realised there, it means that people's rights are breached. But I love that moment when you're working with a community and suddenly they feel, oh my goodness, I've got rights here. That's the best kept secret ever that's been, held in our life. I love that moment. And you're right, people don't really understand that they have everyday rights. Economic, social and cultural rights are about the right to health, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to work, the right to social security. And governments often don't pitch the failures that they inflict on communities as rights breaches, and that's often what they are.
But might I venture that it's when you talking in the ways that you do in the article and here hopefully about actual examples of this in practice that actually helps with that realization. It moves it beyond, like that word I used at the very outset, the abstract, to something a little bit more recognizable and familiar, tangible, if that's the right word.
Yeah, they're absolutely, and they're real. And the rights that we've been working on have been around the right to housing, around children's rights, around the right to health with a women's group in North Highland. So they're really practical things that people are experiencing in their everyday life, and practical action can be taken. And the approach that we use has been kind of coined by the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and I used in the first project, in the Housing Rights Project in Leith around 10 years ago. And that's really breaks it down into 4 steps. And the first one is facts. What are the facts that are going on in people's lives? What's the data that we have around these issues? And then it's around the analysis of those issues. Which rights are at stake? How do we identify which rights are going on here, and then identify who the duty bearers are? And then what recourse do we want? What change do we want to see happen? How do we continue to have that dialogue? So it's a really kind of practical approach that we've adopted, and it's been used really successfully in a number of communities now across Scotland, not least Hannah's brilliant project in Cables Wynd House.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see a process just where you start doing it and it does shift things, you feel like it's really working for people. It was really interesting when I first started linking some of the things that the residents were going through to kind of rights, because I remember one person said, it's really sad that we have to even start talking about rights. That's kind of like what he'd associated with, he'd heard about human rights with kind of Amnesty International, or he would associate it with other countries and not this country. And but as time's gone on, I think it's been quite useful to do that kind of linking with the rights side of it, and it's definitely caught the council's attention, and also like the local media have been really interested in it as well, and that's been great to see. The residents just going on themselves and just putting across really clearly like what they want to happen, why it's not good enough, how it is. It's really great to see them just go with it really and have that confidence.
And as is often the way with the IACD and the editions of Practice Insights it puts out, this edition ventures outside of Scotland. We visit Rwanda, Uganda, County Donegal, a Native American indigenous population in I think it's New Mexico off the top of my head. So there's an international dimension to all of this as well. To what extent is maybe that international dimension? I mean, you touched on it or alluded to it a moment ago there, Hannah, in terms of maybe work that maybe Amnesty gets involved in. But to what extent does that kind of maybe crop up in some of the work that you've done, maybe in Double Dykes, Clare, or maybe other work?
Yeah, look, it's integral to the approach. You have to connect the local to the global. The whole point of a rights-based framework is that we have these international laws which we can use and we can support communities to use to hold the duty bearers to account, because the states have already signed up to many of the obligations, like the right to housing, for example. The UK signed up in the 60s. So using international colleagues, friends, alliances, allies, as well as the international framework is really, really important. Making Rights Real has only been going for 5 years, and we've put forward 2 reports to UN committees in the past 6 months. Now, one was at CERD, which is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, back in July 2024, where we highlighted the issues that were happening for Gypsy Travellers in particular in Scotland, and particular around the forced assimilation of Gypsy Travellers in the Tinker experiments, which, if you haven't heard about, was where the Church of Scotland and the state forcibly settled Gypsy Travellers into ghetto-like accommodation, and the legacy of that still continues. So another site that we were working with in Bobbin Mill in Pitlochry, for example, didn't get electricity and hot running water until 2010. So we have highlighted those issues to CERD, to the UN committee, which then makes recommendations back to the states. And one of the recommendations was that the Scottish Government and the UK Government actually needs to do much more to reflect the needs and the rights of Gypsy Travellers and the rights of victims to the horrific Tinker experiments, actually to be involved in processes towards reparation. So it's really important that we have that international framework that we can use, utilise, and get experts involved in. I remember when we were doing the first housing rights project in Leith back in 2014, and we had experts from Harvard involved, because quite often there's an epistemic injustice when people are in communities are talking about their issues. The duty bearer doesn't want to think that they're breaching rights. They don't like that language, because the language of accountability and the language of change is not really in their lexicon. So quite often there's then a pressure not to speak truth to power, and there's pressure put on activists or on workers to be silent or to not raise these issues in a particular way. And often there's a kickback from when there is an approach to hold public authorities to account. So in that respect, also the international allyship and the international framework of human rights obligations is where it comes into the fore. So we had some instances in that in Scotland, and we got Mary Lawler, who's the UN rapporteur for human rights defenders, involved. And in fact, I did a whole series of podcasts called the Fearless Podcasts, which was investigating what's going on for people who are speaking truth to power in communities in Scotland. And there were lots of issues around people being doxxed, their information being put online, threats being made against them, death threats being made against them. And that series of podcasts also kind of looked at, what protections are there for human rights defenders who speak truth to power here in Scotland and in the UK, and offered some recommendations. So there are some gaps still, and certainly some challenges in using rights as an approach, but we definitely found that the international alliances and IACD and other networks are really helpful when you're supporting communities to really shake the tree that's holding back progress often.
And it can be a lonely place to be, putting your head above the parapet and being that person that is holding truth to power or trying to. And actually, in that regard, might actually be quite a long journey for somebody, Hannah, who you referred to, for example, with yourselves in Cables Wynd, is like keep themselves to themselves and, don't make eye contact with people, don't get involved in things. that then becomes a really long journey to being that person that actually then speaks up or is the face or the voice of maybe a wider constituency.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose we've always really tried to kind of strengthen, make it not that it's just one or two activists in that building who are doing everything, but actually that there's quite a big group, So when we launched our report to the council a few months ago, we had all the different recommendations and the different issues, and then a different person spoke about each one and how it had affected them personally, and we had some kids talking about their kind of reflections on it as well. So I suppose that's really important, really, that kind of sense that it's not just one or two people, but that it just trying to widen that group of people and have that sense that kind of everyone's doing it together. And I think that's why the sort of softer stuff like fun days and there's a whole events team now at the flats as well, and we're having a party tomorrow, just to celebrate the fact that we've done all this work and we're making a difference. And that feels really important, actually, that people now have each other to call on. And also I remember talking to Claire when, before we'd really started using a human rights based approach, and she was talking about the risk of, for example, the charity that I work for, they run services for street homeless people and get money from City of Edinburgh Council. So we don't want to be the only organisation that is campaigning about this issue. It feels like the residents are in a much stronger position if you position a lot of different organisations kind of around them, and that's kind of always what we've tried to do, is build up those links. So we've got quite a few different partners who are now really supportive of the residents, can support them in different ways, bring kind of different aspects of their skill set and their workers to kind of help the residents group. So yeah, I think it's important that it's a collective thing and not just one person, especially if they've, like a lot of people have also just got a lot of other stuff going on in their lives, like health issues or caring responsibilities, or just the stress of living in a place that doesn't feel safe or that's mouldy, that's really difficult. So having that kind of well-being side and supportive side is just so important, alongside kind of that claiming rights and putting yourself out there and being quite challenging to your landlord.
Preempt my question, Hannah, to be honest, was who else is involved in this sort of work, both maybe on a specific basis in your context, but who else have you kind of worked with in other contexts? Claire, do you want to give a shout out to some of your allies?
Simon Hoffman has been really leading the stuff in Wales around the children's rights, which Scotland actually took a wee following from. So there's good stuff happening there. I mean, our mates in Belfast, I don't know if you've heard of PPR, Participation in the Practice of Rights. They're doing phenomenal work around rights, and indeed have been doing this since 2006. So we kind of worked alongside them in the Housing Rights Working Week in 2014, and they really were the ones who set us off in this journey around using human rights in community development. So they've been fundamental in supporting us and, in their allyship of us when things get tough. But also folk like Professor Alicia Al-Yamin at Harvard University, who's fantastic around the right to health and has been supporting some of our activists around how do they raise these issues around the right to health. Of course, Anastasia Crickley, who is Professor Emeritus at Maynooth University, has always been a big supporter of our work and saw that nexus of community development and human rights being together as one in an intersectional kind of way to address the issues of, systemic racism and sexism and neoliberalism has the impact on communities, has been fantastic and supportive of us. So, building that network is a key part of what we do, and also having quite a bit of fun is a key part of what we do. I think Hannah, the work that Hannah and I both did with Fosside Women and Girls Group, looking at as an intergenerational group, looking at gender-based budgeting and how do we follow the money, about how decisions are made around public authorities taking decisions about women and girls, for example. And they're the best fun ever. And they've come up with lots of games around human rights, rights and tights and the Price is Rights and those kind of stuff. So we've had quite a lot of fun with the work we've been doing as well, haven't we, Hannah?
Definitely. Yeah, I think the first time I visited that group, I ended up doing some like the Macarena by the end of the night, I think. So that gives you a flavour of that group.
For sure.
It doesn't count as community development work
brilliant.
if it doesn't end in the Macarena. It doesn't qualify. Thank you for the plug to Wales. I'm not here, representing Wales or anything, but it's clearly it's close to my heart and where I work, and anything I know I tend to glean from working here. But I think an interesting dimension, and maybe one that still has a long way to go at a very conceptual level to really get under the skin of, and really kind of, what does this mean quite substantively then, is not just the rights of people today, citizens today, but future generations. And we have in Wales this Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, where there's a statutory duty on public bodies to make decisions, not just a tokenistic consideration as to what will be the impact on the future generations, but to make it intrinsic and at the heart of that decision-making process. And that's a rights-based approach as well, and about the rights of people who aren't here to express themselves, who literally don't have any rights kind of yet as citizens because they've not been born yet. So I think that's an interesting dimension as well, that maybe just takes it a little bit more, well, certainly into the future, but maybe brings with it a certain level of abstraction that can maybe be a bit sort of discombobulating to us when you're trying to kind of get your head around some of this, particularly maybe at an entry level, but nevertheless is all within this broader kind of ballpark of rights, I guess, and rights-based approaches.
Definitely.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we're looking at that in Scotland as well. I know the Scottish Parliament were to be looking at the Futures Initiative work based on, the Futures Commissioner that you have in Wales. So, kudos to you, and hopefully the other devolved nations will be able to learn a bit more and share each other's practice and knowledge about, how do we actually advance the work that we are doing to serve the communities that we have now and the ones of the future.
I noticed, I think the other day, I saw something about plans being set out by the Scottish Government for a community wealth building act or form of community wealth building legislation. I forget the exact wording. Apologies if I'm a little bit wide of the mark there, but it got me thinking. I thought, well, I wouldn't mind one of those down here in Wales. So maybe we can trade. We'll trade a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act for a community wealth building act. But interesting. That kind of diversion at a policy level in these islands over the last sort of 20 years. Actually, that's an episode we did many years ago with Dr. Sinead Pearce from Cardiff University, who looked at that kind of devolution divide and community and social policy, and how it has maybe taken different routes depending on the jurisdictions you're in. And maybe I should I'm seeing Sinead next week, actually. I'll ask her if she wants to come on and maybe give an update, a more contemporary position on that episode we did.
That'd be really interesting.
Okay, maybe begin to wrap up. Again, another plug to your articles in the recent edition of Practice Insights. So that's about sort of February, March 2025. I think it's issue 22. But you've also got an article that isn't out yet. It's going to be in Concepts. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that journal? Maybe people don't know about that outlet, let alone the article, Hannah.
Yeah. So Concept is a great journal that is kind of open access, and it is all about community development. And I think they publish it roughly quarterly. I think it came out of the Edinburgh University Community Education Department. That might be right, or it might not be, but I know some of them are involved. If you just type in Concept Journal online, there's loads of great articles that you can just see for free, which is kind of why I wanted to. This is the article that I've got coming up, will be out in the middle of April online, and it's essentially a kind of summary of my master's dissertation, a very short summary, because I just wanted to share kind of some of the things I've been learning, really, because I was doing this master's and writing it alongside all this work. And what I was really interested in is, particularly because Cables Wynd House is quite a diverse community, actually. There's quite a big Sudanese community in the building. There's a lot of different languages spoken, and I've always been really interested in that kind of sense of maybe integration or peace building, you might call it. In my article, I've ended up calling it multi-directional integration, so that to recognise that it's not just, the new people that have to integrate, but that integration is kind of a process in a community where people start to trust each other, start to work together and accept each other, things like that. Yeah, the article is called Community Health and Multi-Directional Integration in Cables Wynd House. And then it's kind of just suggests kind of a model, really, of steps that one might take to kind of, if you're working in a community that is suffering both from maybe poverty or poor community health, but also has that element of that kind of bad reputation, or you might call it, there's a kind of intellectual tradition of kind of territorial stigma that came from Waquant in 2008. He wrote about that, of areas of cities in Europe becoming these kind of no-go zones, or areas that have got a bad reputation. And I wrestle with that a little bit in the article, because I feel like every time you use those words, it kind of risks stigmatizing those areas even more. So I try to avoid it, but also kind of acknowledge it, and then talk about ideas for how to work as a community development worker in that sort of setup, and things that seem helpful from the literature and a bit from my own experience as well. So that's coming up in the middle of April.
Amazing, and it's a brilliant article, Hannah. I can't wait for it to be out there and for people to be having that dialogue with you, because I think you've done a fantastic job of it, and it's brilliant to see that your written work has been published. So well done.
Thanks, Claire.
Yeah, quick plug to the website, concept.lib.ac.uk, and I think the most recent edition, according to this, I'm looking at volume 15, number 3, 2024 winter, so published in December. So yeah, probably one due out, if not already out, by the time this reaches listeners. So if anybody, Claire, wanted to know about specifically your work with Gypsy Travellers and the work in Double Dykes, about Making Rights Real as an organisation, some of the other stuff you're involved in, what's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, sure. You can follow us on our website, which is makingrightsreal.org.uk, or we're on Blue Sky at makingrightsreal.bsky. So, follow us there. We're in that transition of coming off of X, so we won't be on there much longer. We're also on LinkedIn as well. But I also want to plug the IACD, because it's a brilliant organisation that I've been fortunate to be involved with for around 10 years. And it's a great space to get that global network of community development academics, practitioners who, are often the backbone to the work that's happening globally. And you can follow IACD on Twitter at IACD_global, or indeed become a member. Just pop on their website, which is iacdglobal.org, and join the growing membership of community development practitioners around the world.
And while we're talking about the IACD, why not give a plug as well to the podcast that it puts out, not least because I help produce it, soundcloud.com/IACD_global. And there's a series of podcasts there related to the 2022 book that came out on Routledge called International Community Development Practice. And there's essentially an episode per chapter in that book, with a range of contributors from all over the globe. We've got Hong Kong, we've got Scotland, we've got Mongolia, Australia, different parts of North America, Latin America. So a real international flavour, which hopefully I've tried to bring. We've tried to bring to this as well, and indeed is a strong element of the Practice Insights editions as well. Not least the most recent one. Hannah, yourself in Leith, if people are interested in knowing a little bit more about your work, knowing a bit more about Leith that isn't in an Irving Welsh novel
or a Proclaimers.
Or a Proclaimers lyric, yes. How's the best way of them doing that?
Yeah, so you can find out a bit more about Inspiring Leith via the bigger charity that we're part of. So that's bethanychristiantrust.com. Also, the Cables Wynd House residents group, they'll be setting up their own website. They're on Facebook as well. So do kind of get in touch with them or have a look at what they're doing, because they're kind of, the point of Inspiring Leith is really to get groups to that place where it's their thing, really, it's not our thing. So if you just Google Cables Wynd House Residents Group, you'll probably see some of their latest news articles that have come up. You might find them on Facebook, and hopefully soon you'll find their website as well.
And that's Wynd, WYND, isn't it?
Yes, WYND, Cables Wynd.
So Hannah, Claire, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for having us, Russell. And, I'd encourage people, if they're unsure about how to use a rights-based approach, have a look at this practice insights and do get in touch if you want to have a chat around how you might make this work in your own community.
Yeah.
I think that's the perfect note on which to wrap this up. Would love to hear a bit more about where those residents, with you, Hannah, at Cables Wynd, go in the next few months. It's quite exciting when that kind of begins to happen, isn't it? There's that energy, isn't there? No doubt there'll be bumps in the road, there'll be some disappointments along the way and challenges, but it's a lovely time when you see that energy really begin to kind of cohere and that collective kind of spirit begin to, that feistiness begins to happen. I'm doing something with my hands here that no one can see clearly, but it's as if I've got a crystal ball here and I'm massaging it or something,
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, it is.
So,
it's amazing.
I'd love to hear a bit more.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, thanks, Russell.
Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at comdevt podcast, COMMDEVT podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the CD podcast.